Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, I want you to tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching this video from, and what time is it right now? And if you haven't already, subscribe, because stories like this were never meant to be remembered. Tonight's title sounds impossible. A merchant, respectable, wealthy, trusted. And yet, in 1839 Charleston, a man crossed a line so unthinkable that even history chose to look away. How does a marriage turn into a transaction? How does love become paperwork? And how does an entire city stay silent while something this dark unfolds in plain sight? This is not just a scandal. It's a question Charleston never answered. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why. Charleston in 1839 was a city that mastered the art of appearing civilized. From a distance, it looked refined, almost graceful, a place where gas lamps flickered softly against brick walls, and the harbor shimmered with opportunity. Ships arrived daily, heavy with goods and promises, their sails lowered as merchants calculated profits and losses with practiced calm. The streets echoed with the rhythm of commerce, carriage wheels against stone, polite greetings exchanged between men who believed themselves to be the architects of order. Everything about Charleston suggested stability, tradition, and control. Yet that sense of order was carefully constructed, resting on foundations that were never meant to be examined too closely. The city's wealth did not come from chance. It came from systems that rewarded silence and punished questions. Cotton, rice, and trade flowed through Charleston's ports, and behind every shipment stood invisible hands and unheard voices. Respectability was currency here, as valuable as gold. A man's reputation could open doors that money alone could not, and once earned, it was fiercely protected. Society functioned less on truth and more on perception. What people believed mattered far more than what actually happened behind closed doors. The social hierarchy was rigid, yet subtly enforced. At the top stood influential merchants, planters, and officials, men whose names appeared in ledgers, churches, and social invitations. Their power was not always written into law, but it was understood by everyone who mattered. These men were seen as pillars of the community, symbols of stability in a world that feared chaos more than injustice. To question them was to risk isolation, to invite suspicion, and to lose one's place within the carefully balanced structure of Charleston society. Public life in the city followed strict, almost theatrical rules. Politeness was expected, emotions were restrained, and appearances were curated with precision. A well-dressed couple walking along the Battery told a story of harmony and success, regardless of what waited for them at home. Churches preached morality, newspapers praised progress, and social gatherings reinforced the illusion that Charleston was both rouse and principled. Yet beneath the sermons and headlines lay a collective agreement not to look too deeply, not to ask what sustained such comfort. Women, particularly married women, occupied a precarious position within this world. They were expected to embody virtue and obedience, to maintain the household and reflect their husband's status. Legally and socially, their identities were absorbed into marriage, their independence reduced to little more than a formality. A woman's security depended almost entirely on the man she married, and the law rarely intervened on her behalf. In Charleston, this was not considered cruelty but order, a natural arrangement reinforced by tradition and scripture. The law itself was both powerful and selective. It existed to protect property, contracts, and commerce, not necessarily people. Legal language was precise, but morality was not its concern. If something could be justified through paperwork, it often escaped scrutiny. This created an environment where actions that should have been unthinkable could be reframed as transactions, where human lives could be discussed in the same tone as cargo or land. The system did not need to be openly cruel. It simply needed to function efficiently. Charleston's economy thrived on this efficiency. Merchants were admired for their ability to navigate risk, to make hard decisions in pursuit of success. Ruthlessness, when hidden behind politeness, was often mistaken for strength. Failure, on the other hand, was unforgivable. A man who fell from respectability did not simply lose money, he lost his identity. The fear of such a fall haunted the city's elite, pushing them toward choices they might never acknowledge publicly. Gossip existed, of course, but it was carefully managed. Whispers traveled through kitchens and back rooms, rarely reaching places where they could cause real damage. Everyone knew that certain topics were dangerous, better left untouched. When rumors surfaced about influential figures, they were softened, redirected, or quietly dismissed. Charleston excelled at turning discomfort into silence. The city understood that stability depended not on justice, but on the appearance of harmony. Religion played a significant role in reinforcing this mindset. Churches were central to community life, offering moral guidance that conveniently aligned with existing power structures. Sermons emphasized obedience, order, and acceptance of one's place. Questioning authority was often framed as a moral failing, a temptation to be resisted. Faith, in this context, became another layer of insulation, protecting those at the top from scrutiny while encouraging others to endure their circumstances quietly. The physical beauty of Charleston contributed to the illusion. Grand homes with wide porches and manicured gardens suggested generosity and refinement. These houses were stages upon which success was displayed, their walls hiding realities that did not fit the narrative. Cedars saw elegance and assumed virtue, never imagining what decisions were being made in the privacy of those rooms. The city's charm was not accidental, it was a deliberate distraction. Within this environment, power operated subtly. It did not always announce itself through violence or threats. More often it appeared as opportunity or protection. Aligning oneself with the right people could mean security, while crossing them could mean ruin. This unspoken understanding shaped behavior at every level of society. People learned to measure their words, to weigh the consequences of curiosity, and to accept that some truths were simply not meant to surface. Marriage, in particular, was treated as both a social contract and an economic arrangement. Love was secondary, sometimes irrelevant. Alliances were formed, assets combined, reputations strengthened. Once married, a woman's legal existence was largely absorbed into her husband's, a fact so normalized that few questioned it. This imbalance was not hidden, it was openly acknowledged, yet rarely challenged. In Charleston, this was simply how things were done. The city's legal framework reflected these values. Laws were written by men who benefited from them, interpreted by courts that prioritized stability over fairness. Gray areas were plentiful, and within those gray areas, power thrived. What could not be done openly could often be achieved through careful wording and strategic silence. The law did not ask whether something was right, only whether it was permitted. Against this backdrop, the idea of personal morality became flexible. Right and wrong were not fixed points but negotiable concepts, influenced by status and circumstance. A respected merchant could be forgiven for actions that would destroy someone of lesser standing. Accountability was uneven, distributed according to influence rather than evidence. This imbalance was widely understood, even if it was rarely discussed openly. Charleston's society depended on collective participation in this illusion. Everyone played a role, whether through active enforcement or passive acceptance. Silence was rewarded with security, while dissent invited consequences. Over time, this dynamic became self-sustaining. People stopped expecting justice and focused instead on survival within the system as it was. The city did not need to hide its darkness completely. It only needed to ensure that no one spoke about it loudly enough to matter. By 1839, this culture was deeply ingrained. Generations had grown up learning which questions were dangerous and which answers were acceptable. Children inherited not only wealth and property, but also silence. The past was preserved selectively, with uncomfortable truths left to fade. History, like reputation, was curated to protect the image Charleston wanted to project. In such a city, extraordinary wrongdoing did not always appear extraordinary. When power, law, and silence align, even the most disturbing acts see and be absorbed into the background of daily life. What should have shocked the conscience instead became another unspoken secret, another compromise made in the name of order. Charleston did not see itself as cruel, it saw itself as practical. This was the world in which respectability could coexist with moral collapse, where a man's public image could shield actions that defied basic humanity. The city's greatest strength, its ability to maintain appearances, was also its greatest danger. By valuing stability over truth, Charleston created space for acts that would later be described as unthinkable, yet at the time were allowed to unfold quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly. And it was within this carefully balanced, deeply flawed environment that a scandal would emerge, not as a sudden rupture, but as a logical consequence of a system that had long prioritized power over people. A city that refused to look too closely would soon find itself complicit in something it claimed never to have seen. From the outside, the marriage appeared unremarkable, almost forgettable, which was precisely why it escaped scrutiny. In Charleston society, marriages like theirs were common enough to fade into the background of daily life. A respectable man took a wife, established a household, attended church, hosted occasional guests, and carried on with business. Nothing about it invited curiosity. There were no public scandals, no loud disputes spilling into the street, no dramatic gestures that might attract gossip, and in a city that valued appearances above all else, normalcy was the greatest shield a marriage could have. Yet what Charleston accepted as normal often concealed profound imbalance. Marriage in 1839 was not a partnership in any modern sense. It was a legal arrangement that overwhelmingly favored the husband, granting him authority not just over property but over the very existence of his wife. Once married, a woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. She could not easily own property in her own name, enter contracts independently, or make decisions that contradicted his will. The law did not frame this as oppression, it framed it as order. And because it was so deeply embedded in daily life, most people rarely paused to question it. In social settings, the couple played their roles well. He was polite, controlled, and publicly attentive enough to avoid suspicion. She appeared reserved, composed, and dutiful, the kind of woman society praised for her quiet presence rather than her voice. Any discomfort she might have felt was invisible to outsiders, masked by expectation. Charleston did not reward emotional transparency in women, it rewarded restraint. Silence was interpreted as virtue, compliance as grace. And so, whatever tensions existed within that marriage remained hidden behind practiced smiles and carefully chosen words. There were moments, subtle ones, when something seemed slightly off, a pause too long before she spoke, a glance that lingered downward rather than meeting another's eyes. But such signs were easy to dismiss. Women were expected to be modest, deferential, and subdued. If she appeared withdrawn, it was attributed to shyness or good breeding. If she did not contradict her husband, it was seen as proper behavior. The very qualities that might have signaled distress were the same ones society celebrated. Power within the marriage was not expressed through overt cruelty, at least not publicly. It manifested in decisions made without consultation, in plans announced rather than discussed. He controlled finances, movements, and social interactions with an authority that was considered normal for a husband of his standing. She depended on him not only for material security, but for her place in the world. Without him, her position in Charleston society would be precarious at best. That dependence was understood, even expected, and it shaped every aspect of her life. What made this arrangement particularly dangerous was how completely it was supported by law. The legal doctrine of the time treated married women as extensions of their husbands. This was not a secret, it was written into statutes and reinforced by courts. A husband's decisions carried legal weight, while a wife's objections rarely did. Even if she disagreed, even if she feared the direction her marriage was taking, the avenues available to her were painfully limited. Divorce was rare, scandalous, and often inaccessible without wealth or influence. Separation meant social ruin. Staying meant surrender. Charleston society reinforced this trap through expectation and pressure. Families encouraged women to endure difficulties quietly, framing endurance as strength and patience as virtue. Complaints were discouraged, especially if they might embarrass a respected husband. A woman who spoke too openly risked being labeled ungrateful or hysterical, her credibility questioned rather than her circumstances examined. The message was clear. Whatever happened within a marriage was a private matter, not to be aired or challenged publicly. In this environment, the idea that a marriage could conceal something monstrous did not easily occur to people. Marriage was treated as a stabilizing institution, a symbol of order. To question it was to question the foundations of society itself. And so, even if whispers existed, they rarely took shape as accusations. They drifted, vague and unformed, never solid enough to provoke action. Charleston had little appetite for investigating the private lives of its respectable men. The wife's position grew increasingly fragile as her dependence deepened. Without independent means or legal standing, she existed in a state of vulnerability that few openly acknowledged. Her safety relied on her husband's goodwill, her future on his decisions. This was not unique to her. It was the reality for countless women of the era. What made her situation different was not immediate, easily visible. The danger lay not in daily cruelty, but in the possibilities that the law quietly allowed. The husband, meanwhile, understood the power marriage granted him. Whether he reflected on it consciously or simply absorbed it as part of his role, he knew that his authority was rarely questioned. Society trusted him, the law empowered him, and the silence surrounding marital affairs protected him. This combination created a space where imagination could roam unchecked, where boundaries blurred and moral restraints weakened. When authority is absolute and accountability minimal, the unthinkable can begin to feel possible. Outwardly, the marriage fulfilled its social function. Invitations were accepted, obligations met, appearances maintained. There was no dramatic rupture to alert the city that something was wrong. Charleston's social mechanisms were designed to notice disruption, not quiet erosion. As long as the surface remained intact, the structure beneath could decay unnoticed. This was one of the city's greatest blind spots, and it would prove catastrophic. The wife's isolation was not physical alone, it was psychological. Surrounded by people yet profoundly alone, she navigated a world where her voice carried little weight. Even if she sensed danger, articulating it would have been nearly impossible. To whom could she speak? Family members might urge patience, friends might advise discretion. Authorities would defer to her husband's authority. Each potential avenue of help led back to the same conclusion: endure, adapt, remain silent. Marriage, in Charleston's legal and cultural framework, was not merely a relationship but a transfer of control. Once that transfer occurred, reversing it was extraordinarily difficult. This reality was so normalized that it rarely inspired outrage. It was simply accepted as the natural order of things, and because it was ordinary, it was overlooked. No one examined the fine print of a marriage that seemed to function as expected. What makes this stage of the story particularly unsettling is its quietness. There was no single moment when alarms sounded, no clear warning that catastrophe was approaching. Instead, there was a gradual tightening of constraints, an accumulation of small, legally sanctioned decisions that shifted power ever further in one direction. Each step, taken alone, seemed insignificant. Together, they formed a trap. The city's indifference played a crucial role. Charleston prided itself on civility, but that civility often masked avoidance. People preferred not to involve themselves in matters that might disrupt social harmony. A marriage, especially one involving a respected merchant, was considered off-limits. The assumption was that such matters resolved themselves, or at least should be allowed to do so without interference. This hands-off attitude was not neutral, it actively enabled harm. As time passed, the marriage ceased to be a source of security for the wife and became something far more dangerous. Yet to the outside world, nothing had changed. That was the tragedy of it. The system functioned exactly as designed, preserving appearances while eroding humanity. The imbalance of power grew, unchecked and unchallenged, creating conditions where exploitation could be rationalized rather than resisted. This was not a story of sudden betrayal or explosive conflict. It was a story of slow normalization, of a society that taught its members to accept imbalance as tradition. The marriage raised no questions, because the questions themselves were considered inappropriate. Charleston did not ask whether a wife was safe or free, it assumed she was where she belonged, and in that assumption lay the seed of everything that followed. A marriage that appeared ordinary, protected by law and custom, became the perfect cover. The absence of scrutiny was not accidental, it was the result of a culture that valued order over empathy. By the time anyone might have realized something was terribly wrong, the mechanisms that could have prevented it were already aligned against intervention. What makes this stage so chilling is how familiar it all felt to those living within it. Nothing about the marriage screamed danger. It blended seamlessly into the city's rhythm, another respectable household among many. That familiarity dulled suspicion and discouraged curiosity. Charleston did not see a warning sign, it saw routine. And so, without resistance, without protest, without even awareness, a marriage quietly crossed a threshold. It moved from imbalance into something far darker, carried forward by laws that prioritized authority in a society that refused to look too closely. The city would later claim shock at what unfolded, but the truth was more uncomfortable. The conditions that made it possible were visible all along, hidden not by secrecy, but by acceptance. This was how the stage was set, not through chaos, but through calm, not through outrage, but through indifference. A marriage that raised no questions became the doorway through which an unthinkable act would eventually pass, unnoticed until it was far too late to Charleston. He was the kind of man people trusted without thinking twice. His name appeared regularly in business ledgers, shipping manifests, and polite conversations at social gatherings. He was known as disciplined, measured, and respectable, a merchant who understood the rhythms of trade and the delicate balance of risk and reward. He dressed well, spoke carefully, and knew exactly when to smile and when to remain silent. In a city where reputation was everything, he had cultivated his with precision. No one questioned how he achieved his success. They only saw the results and assumed virtue followed prosperity. But success in Charleston was rarely as stable as it appeared. Behind the polished exterior of commerce lay constant uncertainty. Markets shifted, ships were delayed or lost, debts accumulated quietly, and competition was relentless. A merchant's fortune could change with a single failed shipment or an unexpected downturn. To survive, one needed not just intelligence but nerve, and sometimes a willingness to cross lines others hesitated to approach. Over time, the pressure to maintain status became as intense as the pressure to earn profit itself. Publicly, he presented an image of control. He attended church regularly, contributed to social obligations, and maintained the appearance of a man who knew his place and honored it. Privately, however, the strain of expectation weighed heavily. The same society that praised success punished failure without mercy. To lose standing in Charleston was not merely embarrassing, it was catastrophic. Credit dried up, invitations disappeared, and whispers replaced respect. For a man whose identity was built on recognition and authority, the possibility of such a fall was terrifying. The merchant's life began to split into two distinct realities. In one, visible to the world, he was confident and composed. In the other, hidden behind closed doors, calculations dominated his thoughts. Every decision was measured not by morality, but by outcome. He learned to compartmentalize, to separate what he did from how he appeared. This ability, cultivated slowly, allowed him to make choices that would have once seemed unthinkable, all while maintaining the mask of respectability. Charleston rewarded this kind of duality. The city did not demand purity of character, it demanded stability. As long as a man fulfilled his public role and avoided scandal, his private actions were rarely examined. This created a dangerous freedom. Boundaries existed, but they were flexible for those with enough influence. The merchant understood this intuitively. He had seen others navigate moral gray areas without consequence, watched questionable decisions disappear beneath layers of politeness and silence. His business dealings reflected this evolution. Where once he might have hesitated, he now pushed forward. Contracts became more aggressive, risks more pronounced. Each successful maneuver reinforced his belief that outcomes justified methods. When things went well, no one asked how. When they went poorly, he scrambled quietly, determined never to let the city see him falter. The fear of exposure became a constant companion, driving him toward increasingly desperate calculations. Within his household, this shift manifested subtly at first. Decisions were no longer discussed, they were announced. Plans were made without explanation. The authority granted to him by marriage and law fed his sense of control. In a world where he felt increasingly threatened by external forces, the domestic sphere became a place where his power was absolute. This imbalance, sanctioned by society, reinforced his belief that control was both his right and his necessity. He began to view people through the same lens he applied to goods and assets. Value, utility, risk. Essay concepts, essential to commerce, seeped into his personal relationships. Empathy dulled as calculation sharpened. The city had taught him this way of thinking, rewarding efficiency and punishing vulnerability. Over time, it became difficult for him to separate his role as a merchant from his role as a husband. Both were, in his mind, governed by contracts and obligations rather than affection. Charleston's legal framework further emboldened him. He knew the law favored men of his standing. He understood which actions might attract attention and which could be concealed behind paperwork and procedure. The system did not require him to be cruel, it simply allowed him to be indifferent. And indifference, when paired with power, can become lethal. He did not need to see himself as a villain. He could frame his choices as necessary, unfortunate, but justified. Financial strain, whether real or anticipated, intensified this mindset. Even the possibility of loss felt intolerable. The merchant had invested too much in his image to accept decline. Pride intertwined with survival, making compromise seem like weakness. Every problem became something to be solved, not endured. And in Charleston, solutions often came at the expense of those with less power. The more he navigated these pressures, the more isolated he became emotionally. Surrounded by associates and acquaintances, he lacked genuine connection. Relationships were transactional, measured by advantage and obligation. This isolation further eroded his moral grounding. Without voices to challenge him, his thoughts circled inward, reinforcing justifications and dismissing doubt. What might have once shocked him now appeared merely practical. Society's reinforcement of masculine authority played a crucial role. Men like him were praised for decisiveness, for the ability to make hard choices without hesitation. Compassion was admired in theory but rarely rewarded in practice. The merchant absorbed these lessons fully. To hesitate was to risk everything. To act decisively, even ruthlessly, was to prove one's strength. Charleston applauded results, not methods. His double life was not marked by secrecy in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic disguises or hidden identities. Instead, it was defined by selective transparency. He revealed what supported his image and concealed what threatened it. This was a skill he had honed over years in business, now applied seamlessly to his personal life. The city, complicit in this arrangement, accepted the version of him it was shown. As time passed, the gap between appearance and reality widened. He grew comfortable with the idea that morality was flexible, adaptable to circumstance. This belief did not emerge overnight. It was the product of countless small compromises. Each one made the next easier. Each success reinforced the notion that consequences were avoidable. Charleston's silence acted as affirmation, signaling that as long as order was maintained, anything could be tolerated. Within this psychological landscape, empathy became an obstacle rather than a guide. The merchant trained himself to suppress it, viewing emotional hesitation as a liability. When faced with difficult choices, he prioritized outcomes that preserved his status and solvency. The law, the culture, and his own ambitions aligned to support this approach. There was no external force demanding restraint. What is particularly unsettling is that none of this set him apart from his peers. He was not uniquely cruel or visibly unstable. He was, in many ways, a product of his environment. Charleston produced men like him regularly, rewarding those who could navigate its contradictions without hesitation. The difference lay not in his nature, but in how far he was willing to go when tested. As pressures mounted, his thinking narrowed. Complex human realities were reduced to variables in a calculation. Solutions were evaluated based on efficiency rather than ethics. This mindset, once confined to ledgers and contracts, now governed his view of life itself. The boundary between business and humanity dissolved, replaced by a single guiding principle: preserve position at all costs. In quieter moments, if doubt surfaced, it was quickly suppressed. Doubt threatened paralysis, and paralysis threatened ruin. He convinced himself that the world was harsh, that survival required difficult choices, and that sentimentality was a luxury he could not afford. These rationalizations insulated him from guilt, allowing him to move forward without confronting the full weight of his actions. Charleston's social mechanisms ensured that he rarely faced direct challenge. Those who might have questioned him lacked the influence to do so safely. Those with influence had little incentive. As long as he remained useful and unproblematic, his peers saw no reason to intervene. This absence of accountability was not accidental. It was built into the structure of the city's power dynamics. By the time he reached the point of making his most consequential decision, his transformation was complete. What would have once seemed monstrous now appeared logical within the framework he had constructed. He no longer saw himself as choosing between right and wrong, but between survival and collapse. In that equation, humanity was negotiable. This is how his double life functioned, not as a stark contrast between good and evil, but as a gradual shift from conscience to calculation. The merchant Charleston admired was real, but incomplete. Beneath that surface existed another reality shaped by fear, ambition, and a system that rewarded silence. The city did not create a monster overnight. It cultivated one slowly, through expectation, pressure, and permission. And when the moment came to act, there was no dramatic hesitation, no visible struggle. The decision emerged from a mindset long in the making, supported by law, enabled by culture, and shielded by reputation. The merchant did not see himself stepping into darkness. He believed he was simply doing what Charleston had always taught him to do: protect his standing, preserve order, and ensure his own survival, no matter the cost. The moment did not arrive with shouting or violence. There was no sudden outburst, no dramatic confrontation that might later be remembered as the point of no return. Instead, it crept in quietly, disguised as thought, calculation, and necessity. The decision that should never have existed was born not in chaos, but in calm. It emerged from long nights of consideration, from a mind trained to solve problems efficiently and without sentiment. In that stillness, morality did not collapse loudly. It thinned, stretched, and finally gave way. By this stage, the merchant no longer viewed his circumstances through the lens of emotion. Years of pressure had reshaped his thinking. Problems were puzzles, obstacles were variables. Human relationships, once complex and unpredictable, had been reduced to factors in an equation. He told himself he was being practical, realistic, even responsible. Charleston rewarded men who acted decisively, and hesitation was often indistinguishable from failure. In that environment, stopping to question the nature of a decision felt dangerous. The law loomed large in his thoughts, not as a moral guide but as a framework to be navigated. He understood its language, its loopholes, its silences. The legal system did not forbid every atrocity outright. It simply regulated ownership, contracts, and authority. And within those regulations existed spaces where something unspeakable could be rebranded as permissible. The merchant did not invent this reality. He discovered it, explored it, and gradually convinced himself it was usable. At first, the idea may have appeared only as a vague possibility, a fleeting thought dismissed as too extreme. But once imagined, it did not disappear. It lingered, resurfacing whenever pressure mounted. Each time it returned, it seemed slightly less impossible. This is how dangerous decisions take root. They do not arrive fully formed. They grow through repetition and justification. What once horrified slowly became conceivable, then plausible, and finally actionable. He began to test the idea against the world he knew. Would anyone stop him? Would anyone question him? The answers, based on observation and experience, were unsettlingly clear. Charleston did not interfere in the private affairs of respected men. The law deferred to authority. Society preferred not to know. The more he examined the environment around him, the more the boundaries appeared flexible. What should have been a wall revealed itself as a curtain. Crucially, the decision was framed not as cruelty, but as necessity. He told himself stories to soften its edges. This was not about malice, he reasoned, but survival. Not about desire, but inevitability. In his mind, he became a man forced by circumstance to make a hard choice. This narrative allowed him to avoid confronting the reality of what he was contemplating. Language became his shield. By renaming the act, he stripped it of its horror. The absence of immediate resistance emboldened him. There was no external voice to challenge the path he was considering. No friend confronted him. No authority questioned him. Even within himself, doubt had grown faint. The system he lived within did not just allow such thinking, it encouraged it. Charleston prized outcomes, not introspection. As long as order was maintained, methods were rarely scrutinized. What makes this moment particularly disturbing is its deliberateness. This was not an act of impulse. It was planned, evaluated, and refined. He weighed potential consequences, not in terms of human cost, but in terms of risk to himself. Would his reputation survive? Could the paperwork be managed? Were there precedents, even obscure ones, that might support his actions? These were the questions that occupied his mind. The absence of empathy was not sudden. It was the result of long conditioning. In quieter moments, he may have sensed the enormity of what he was preparing to do. But such moments were fleeting. They were quickly overwhelmed by fear of loss, fear of exposure, fear of falling from the position he had fought to secure. Charleston had taught him that losing status was worse than losing virtue. Once that lesson is internalized, almost anything can be justified. The decision also relied heavily on invisibility. It depended on the assumption that no one would look too closely. That assumption was not baseless. The city had proven time and again that it preferred not to see. Silence was not accidental, it was habitual. The merchant trusted this silence as much as he trusted contracts and laws. It was, in many ways, his most reliable asset. There was a chilling rationality to how he approached the matter. He did not see it as destroying something sacred. He saw it as reallocating control. Marriage, in his view, was already a transfer of authority. The law had made that clear. He was simply extending a logic that society had already accepted. This is where the true horror lies. The act did not feel like a radical departure from the norm, but an extreme application of it. He considered the mechanics carefully. Every step needed to appear legitimate. There could be no spectacle, no emotional display that might raise suspicion. Everything would be conducted through proper channels, with appropriate documentation. Bureaucracy became a tool of erasure, reducing a human being to a line item. In this process, the decision lost its emotional weight, replaced by procedural focus. The moral distance created by paperwork is immense. Forms do not scream, contracts do not plead. They sit quietly, waiting for signatures. By engaging with these tools, the merchant insulated himself from the immediate reality of his choice. He could tell himself he was dealing with abstractio. NS, not a person. This detachment was essential. Without it, the decision might have collapsed under its own cruelty. The environment around him reinforced this detachment. Charleston's institutions were not designed to intervene in matters framed as legal and private. Clergy preached obedience. Courts prioritized order. Neighbors minded their own affairs. Each layer of society contributed to a sense that what was being planned, however disturbing, would proceed without interruption. The merchant was not acting against the system. He was operating within it. Fear played a central role, but not the fear of doing wrong. It was the fear of losing control, of being exposed as vulnerable, of slipping into irrelevance. These fears crowded out any lingering sense of compassion. When survival is defined narrowly enough, humanity becomes optional. The merchant had reached that point. His world had shrunk to a single imperative: protect himself. What is most unsettling is how calm this phase was. There was no visible descent into madness, no signs that might have alerted those around him. He continued his routines, attended gatherings, conducted business. The decision existed alongside ordinary life, compartmentalized and contained. This normalcy made it easier to proceed. If everything else remained unchanged, how wrong could the decision really be? He may have even convinced himself that others would have done the same in his position. Charleston was full of men who spoke proudly of making hard choices. He told himself he was no different, merely more honest about the realities of power. This belief further insulated him from self-reflection. By imagining his actions as typical, he stripped them of moral weight. As the decision solidified, it became less a question and more a plan. Once that transition occurred, turning back grew increasingly difficult. Planning creates momentum. Each step taken commits the next. By the time he reached this stage, the decision had woven itself into his understanding of the future. Abandoning it would require confronting everything he had become. The terrifying truth is that nothing in his world clearly forbade what he was about to do. There was no bright line he could point to and say, "Here is where it becomes impossible." Instead, there was only a gradual slope smoothed by law and custom. He walked down it willingly, guided by a system that had never demanded he stop. This decision did not feel dramatic to him. It felt administrative, necessary, inevitable. That is what made it possible. The absence of emotional turmoil was not a sign of peace, but of erosion. By the time he committed fully to the idea, the part of him capable of recoiling had already been dulled, and so the line was crossed, not with a leap, but with a step. A quiet, deliberate step, taken in the confidence that the world would not intervene. The decision that should never have existed now did, fully formed and ready to be acted upon. It was no lounge, hypothetical. It was real. Charleston would later claim shock, disbelief, outrage. But in that moment, there was nothing in the city's structures that truly opposed what was about to happen. The law allowed space. Society offered silence. Reputation provided cover. The decision was not an aberration, it was a consequence. This is how the unthinkable becomes possible. Not through sudden evil, but through careful reasoning in a world that rewards calculation over conscience. The merchant did not wake up one day transformed. He arrived here step by step, guided by fear, ambition, and a system that never forced him to choose differently. And once that decision settled into certainty, the rest became a matter of execution. The hardest part was already over. The moral boundary had been crossed, and on the other side there was only process. What followed would be horrifying, but in his mind it was already justified. The city, unaware or unwilling to know, stood ready to absorb the consequences in silence. Once the decision had been made, everything that followed unfolded with a chilling sense of order. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public declaration that might have alerted the city. Instead, the process moved through channels that Charleston trusted deeply: documents, signatures, formal language. Paperwork had a unique power in that world. It transformed actions into procedures and moral questions into technicalities. What could not be justified emotionally could often be legitimized administratively, and that was the path chosen here. The law did not ask why an action was taken. It asked only whether it complied with existing rules. This distinction mattered more than most people realized. Legal systems are often portrayed as moral arbiters, but in practice they function as frameworks for order. In 1839 Charleston, those frameworks were designed to protect property, authority, and commerce. Human dignity was not their primary concern. When people became objects within those systems, the transition was disturbingly smooth. Language played a crucial role in this transformation. The words used in documents were precise, unemotional, and sanitized. They did not describe suffering or fear. They described transfers, permissions, obligations. Each phrase stripped away another layer of humanity. By the time the process was complete on paper, the reality it represented had been reduced to something abstract. This abstraction was not accidental. It was the mechanism that made the act survivable for those involved in carrying it out. Those who handled the paperwork did not see themselves as participants in cruelty. Clerks processed documents every day without questioning their implications. Lawyers focused on compliance and precedent, not consequence. Officials ensured procedures were followed, not that justice was served. Each person involved could tell themselves they were merely doing their job. Responsibility dissolved as it spread across the system, leaving no single individual forced to confront the whole truth. This diffusion of accountability was one of the system's most powerful features. No one had to look directly at what was happening. Each step appeared minor when viewed in isolation. A signature here, a verification there, a record entered into a ledger. The enormity of the act was hidden by its fragmentation. When cruelty is broken into pieces small enough, it becomes manageable, even routine. The merchant understood this instinctively. He did not need to threaten or coerce the system. He simply navigated it. He knew which offices to approach, which questions to avoid, which explanations were unnecessary. His status smoothed the path further. Respectability acted as a silent endorsement, discouraging scrutiny. People assumed that a man like him would not misuse the law. That assumption was the system's blind spot. What makes this stage so horrifying is how ordinary it was. Nothing about the process stood out as unusual to those involved. Charleston was accustomed to transactions involving human lives. The city's economy depended on them. In that context, the paperwork did not feel exceptional. It fit seamlessly into existing practices, borrowing their language and legitimacy. The act was not framed as a moral rupture, but as an extension of established norms. Paper has a way of creating distance. It allows people to engage with outcomes without confronting experiences. A name becomes an entry. A person becomes a category. Suffering disappears behind ink. This distance was essential. Without it, the process might have collapsed under the weight of its own brutality. But the system was designed to prevent that collapse, to keep human consequences out of view. The wife's reality, however, did not disappear simply because it was absent from the documents. Her existence was being redefined without her consent, her agency erased through legal mechanisms she had no power to challenge. Yet within the paperwork, her voice did not matter. The law did not require it. Her silence was assumed, her compliance presumed. This was not seen as a flaw in the system, but as proof of its efficiency. Charleston's legal culture reinforced this efficiency. Speed and order were valued. Delays were seen as problems, not safeguards. Once the process began, there was little incentive to slow it down. Each completed step validated the next. Momentum built quietly, carrying the act forward with bureaucratic inevitability. To interrupt it would require someone to question not just the decision, but the system itself. That was unlikely. The merchant benefited enormously from this momentum. As long as the process continued, doubt receded. Action replaced hesitation. He could tell himself that if it were truly wrong, someone would intervene. The absence of intervention became a form of permission. This is one of the most dangerous illusions created by bureaucracy, the belief that legality equals legitimacy. Even the physical environment contributed to this illusion. Offices were orderly, controlled spaces, far removed from the human impact of the decisions made within them. The calm of these settings contrasted sharply with the violence inherent in what was being authorized. That contrast numbed perception. It was easier to see the process as administrative rather than destructive. There was also a strategic advantage in relying on paperwork. Documents outlast people. They create records that can be referenced, defended, and hidden behind. Should questions arise later, the merchant could point to legality. He could argue compliance. Paper became both sword and shield, enabling the act and protecting its author. The system's reliance on precedent further insulated those involved. If similar actions had occurred before, even in different contexts, they could be cited as justification. History, selectively interpreted, became a tool for normalizing the present. The fact that something had been done before was often enough to silence objections. Charleston's past, carefully curated, provided cover for its present. This stage of the story exposes a truth that is deeply uncomfortable. Atrocities do not always require hatred or rage. Sometimes they require only indifference and procedure. The people who facilitated the act did not need to believe it was right. They needed only to believe it was permitted. That belief was enough. The merchant's emotional detachment deepened as the process advanced. With each completed document, the act felt more real and less reversible. Commitment hardened into resolve. The possibility of stopping became increasingly remote. Turning back would require not only moral courage but public exposure. The paperwork, once initiated, created its own gravity. What is particularly disturbing is how invisible all of this was to the broader city. Life in Charleston continued uninterrupted. Carriages rolled through the streets. Social events were planned. Commerce flowed. The machinery of daily life absorbed the act without disruption. This normalcy was not accidental. It was the system working as intended. Stability was preserved, even as humanity was sacrificed. The law's focus on form over substance played a critical role. As long as procedures were followed, outcomes were considered valid. This approach left little room for moral intervention. Questions about fairness or cruelty were treated as secondary, if they were considered at all. The system was not broken, it was functioning exactly as designed. For the wife, the experience was the opposite of abstract. While paperwork reduced her existence to a legal construct, her reality remained painfully concrete. Fear, confusion, and loss were not mitigated by legal language. Yet none of that appeared in the records. The system did not account for it, and therefore did not see it. Charleston's culture of deference compounded the problem. Few people were willing to challenge a respected merchant's actions, especially when they were cloaked in legality. To do so would require confronting both social hierarchy and institutional authority. The risks of such confrontation were high, and the rewards uncertain. Most chose silence. This silence was not passive, it was active participation. By accepting the paperwork as sufficient justification, the city collectively endorsed the outcome. No one needed to speak in favor of the act. The absence of opposition was enough. This is how systems perpetuate harm without overt violence, through quiet consensus. The transformation of a human life into a legal transaction reveals the true power of bureaucratic systems. They can make the unimaginable seem ordinary. They can turn moral catastrophes into administrative footnotes. And they can do so without requiring anyone involved to see themselves as cruel. By the time the process reached its conclusion on paper, the act itself felt almost secondary. What mattered was that everything had been done correctly, that boxes had been checked, that records aligned. The success of the procedure overshadowed the horror of its purpose. This inversion of priorities was not questioned, it was assumed. Looking back, it is tempting to search for a single moment when someone could have stopped it. A clerk could have refused. An official could have asked questions. A lawyer could have withdrawn. But systems like this are designed to make such moments rare. They distribute responsibility so widely that no one feels empowered to intervene. Each person sees only a fragment, never the whole. The merchant relied on this fragmentation. It allowed him to move forward without facing unified resistance. The system's complexity became his ally. Where morality might have demanded a clear answer, bureaucracy provided endless ambiguity. In that ambiguity, cruelty found space to operate. This stage of the story is not about dramatic villainy. It is about quiet complicity, about how ordinary processes can enable extraordinary harm, about how paperwork, often seen as neutral or boring, can become a vehicle for erasing humanity. Charleston did not need to endorse the act explicitly. It needed only to allow it to proceed. And proceed it did, smoothly and efficiently, wrapped in legality and shielded by silence. By the time anyone might have realized the full extent of what had occurred, the records were already written. The ink had dried. The system had spoken. What remained was not just the outcome, but the unsettling realization that nothing in the process had required anyone to confront the moral reality of their actions. The law had done its job. Order had been maintained. And in doing so, it had demonstrated just how dangerous a system can be when it values procedure over people. Is why paperwork matters, not because it records truth, but because it can conceal it. In 1839 Charleston, paper proved stronger than conscience, transforming an unthinkable act into an admonist. Rate of success. The city would later struggle to reconcile this reality, but at the time there was no disruption, no alarm, only quiet efficiency, and the devastating certainty that what had been done was now officially, irrevocably, allowed. What followed was not outrage, not immediate condemnation, but something far more dangerous: collective avoidance. Charleston did not erupt in protest or demand answers. Instead, the city settled into a familiar pattern, one it had perfected over generations. People sensed that something was wrong, deeply wrong, but sensing was not the same as seeing, and seeing was not the same as speaking. The city chose the safest option available to it: silence. Whispers began, as they always did. They moved softly, carried by glances and unfinished sentences. A pause in conversation, a lowered voice at the end of a dinner table, a rumor shared only after confirming that no one important was listening. But these whispers never hardened into accusations. They lacked names, details, and certainty. Charleston excelled at this kind of half-knowledge. It allowed people to feel informed without becoming responsible. The city had rules about curiosity, though they were never written down. Curiosity was acceptable as long as it did not threaten hierarchy. Asking questions about someone powerful was considered impolite at best, dangerous at worst. And the merchant was not just powerful, he was embedded. His business touched other businesses. His credit supported other fortunes. His reputation was interwoven with the city's sense of itself. To pull at that thread was to risk unraveling far more than one man's story. People told themselves they didn't know enough, that there must be more to it, that respectable men did not commit monstrous acts without reason. This instinct to rationalize was not accidental. It was learned. Charleston taught its citizens to trust appearances, especially when those appearances were reinforced by status and legality. If something had been done through proper channels, many assumed it must somehow be acceptable, even if they could not articulate why. Those who might have spoken out faced a familiar calculation. What would it cost them? Social exile was a real threat. Business relationships could collapse overnight. Invitations would stop arriving. Doors would close quietly but firmly. In a city where belonging was everything, exclusion was a form of punishment few were willing to endure. Silence, by contrast, was rewarded with continued acceptance. Even moral discomfort had its limits. People are capable of living alongside contradiction if it allows them to maintain stability. Charleston was particularly skilled at this. Its prosperity depended on ignoring certain truths. Residents had long learned how to separate discomfort from daily life, how to file it away as unfortunate but unavoidable. This incident, however disturbing, was absorbed into that same mental compartment. Institutions that might have intervened did not. Churches spoke of obedience and order, not justice. Sermons emphasized personal morality without challenging structural power. Clergy were often dependent on the patronage of influential families, and that dependency shaped what was said from the pulpit. Silence here was framed as prudence, restraint, even wisdom. Better not to inflame passions. Better to trust that matters would resolve themselves. The press, too, remained cautious. Newspapers were businesses, reliant on subscriptions, advertisements, and access. Publishing an accusation against a respected merchant carried risks that few editors were willing to take. Without undeniable proof, and sometimes even with it, stories could be softened, buried, or ignored entirely. The absence of coverage created the illusion that nothing significant had occurred. Legal authorities, shielded by procedure, found little reason to act. If the paperwork was in order, their involvement was limited. The law was reactive, not proactive. It did not search for injustice, it responded to formal complaints. And formal complaints required people willing to step forward publicly. In this case, no one did. The system interpreted that absence as consent. Charleston's social elite understood the power of inertia. Doing nothing was often the most effective strategy. Time had a way of dulling even the sharpest discomfort. As days passed without incident, the initial shock faded, conversations moved on, new topics replaced old ones. What had seemed alarming began to feel distant, almost unreal. The city returned to its routines with remarkable speed. This collective forgetting was not entirely unconscious. People made choices about what to remember and what to discard. Remembering required emotional effort and moral reckoning. Forgetting was easier. It allowed life to continue uninterrupted. Charleston chose ease over examination, comfort over confrontation. In doing so, it transformed silence into a shared agreement. Those closest to the situation were often the quietest. Proximity brought risk. Family members, business associates, and neighbors had the most to lose by speaking. They understood the merchant's influence better than anyone. Their silence carried particular weight, signaling to others that resistance was futile or unwelcome. If those nearest remained quiet, why should anyone else speak? The wife's absence from public discourse was especially telling. Her voice was not sought, and had it been offered, it likely would not have been trusted. Women's testimonies were frequently dismissed or minimized, especially when they conflicted with male authority. The assumption was that she was either complicit, confused, or irrelevant. The system did not see her as a reliable narrator of her own experience. This erasure was reinforced by legal doctrine. If the law did not recognize her full autonomy, why would society recognize her account? Her story did not fit neatly into accepted narrative. It challenged the idea that marriage was inherently protective. It suggested that authority could be abused in ways the system did not want to acknowledge. It was easier to pretend she had nothing to say. Charleston's silence was not a single act, but a series of choices repeated daily. Each person who decided not to ask a question, not to share a concern, not to press for clarity contributed to the outcome. Responsibility was diluted across the city, making it feel weightless. No one felt solely accountable, and so no one acted. The merchant continued to move through society largely unchanged. He attended gatherings, conducted business, maintained his routines. His presence alone served as reassurance. If he could walk freely, unchallenged, then perhaps there was nothing to challenge. Appearances once again did their work, smoothing over unease and discouraging inquiry. Over time, the story became distorted. Details blurred. Facts were replaced by speculation. Some people convinced themselves the rumors had been exaggerated. Others assumed there had been misunderstandings. Without clear information, imagination filled the gaps, often in ways that minimized discomfort. The truth, already fragile, became harder to grasp with each retelling. This process of distortion was aided by the city's hierarchical structure. Narratives flowed downward from those with influence. If the powerful framed the situation as resolved or insignificant, that framing spread. Those lower in the hierarchy adopted it consciously or not. Dissenting interpretations struggled to survive without institutional support. Silence also functioned as a warning. It signaled to anyone watching that certain topics were dangerous. The absence of public discussion was itself a message. Do not pursue this. Do not ask questions. Do not disturb the balance. People learned from observation as much as from instruction. They saw what was not said and understood why. Charleston had long practiced this kind of social self-regulation. It was how the city maintained cohesion despite deep inequalities and contradictions. By avoiding open conflict, it preserved a sense of order. But that order came at a cost. It required the suppression of truth and the normalization of harm. This incident was not an exception. It was an example of how the system functioned. The danger of such silence is that it reshapes moral boundaries. When wrongdoing goes unchallenged, it begins to feel less like wrongdoing and more like precedent. Each unspoken act expands the range of what seems possible. Charleston's refusal to see did not just conceal the past, it altered the future. For those who felt unease, the silence was suffocating. Doubt lingered, unresolved. Some carried it quietly, unsure how to reconcile their discomfort with the city's calm. Others pushed it away, choosing not to dwell on something they felt powerless to change. Both responses served the same end: inaction. The city's ability to absorb the scandal without visible disruption was often cited as evidence of its resilience. But resilience, in this case, was indistinguishable from denial. The structures that allowed life to continue uninterrupted were the same ones that prevented accountability. Stability was maintained, but at the cost of integrity. As weeks turned into months, the story receded further into the background. New events captured attention: economic concerns, social gatherings, and daily routines filled the space where outrage might have grown. Memory faded, not because the act was forgotten, but because it was deliberately left unexamined. Charleston's choice not to see was not passive blindness. It was an active refusal to engage. The city had the capacity to question, to investigate, to challenge. It simply chose not to. That choice was shaped by fear, convenience, and self-interest, but it was a choice nonetheless. This silence had consequences beyond the immediate moment. It signaled to others with power that boundaries were negotiable. It demonstrated that legality and respectability could shield almost anything. The lesson was clear: if you operated within the system and maintained appearances, the city would protect you. In this way, Charleston became complicit not through action, but through omission. It did not need to endorse the act explicitly. Its refusal to confront it was endorsement enough. The city's silence became part of the story, as significant as any document or decision that came before. What makes this chapter especially unsettling is its familiarity. Societies often imagine wrongdoing as loud and obvious, accompanied by chaos and resistance. But here, the opposite was true. The wrongdoing was quiet, procedural, and met with polite avoidance. It blended into daily life, leaving little trace beyond an unease that few dared to articulate. Charleston's people told themselves they were powerless, that the system was too entrenched, that speaking would change nothing. These beliefs became self-fulfilling. By accepting them, the city ensured that nothing would change. Silence hardened into tradition, and so the scandal passed into a strange limbo, known but not acknowledged, sensed but not spoken. It existed in the margins of memory, a shadow that followed the city without ever fully emerging into light. This was perhaps the most devastating outcome of all, not just that something horrific occurred, but that it was allowed to dissolve into quiet acceptance. The city that chose not to see did more than ignore a single act. It reaffirmed a way of life built on selective vision. It taught itself, once again, that order mattered more than truth, and that stability was worth almost any price. In doing so, Charleston ensured that the damage would not end with one scandal. It would echo forward, shaping what came next, protected by the same silence that had allowed it to happen in the first place. What followed was not justice in any meaningful sense of the woe. There were no public trials that exposed the full truth, no formal reckoning that matched the scale of what had been done. Instead, there was a careful recalibration, a quiet adjustment designed to limit damage rather than confront wrongdoing. Charleston did not ask how such an act had been possible. It asked only how its consequences could be contained. The priority was not accountability, but preservation. The first concern was reputation. Reputations in Charleston were not personal possessions. They were social assets, shared and defended collectively. One man's disgrace could ripple outward, staining families, businesses, and institutions. The merchant's standing was tied to others who had invested in him, trusted him, aligned themselves with his success. To allow his name to become synonymous with scandal was to invite instability. And instability was something the city feared above all else. So the narrative began to shift. Where once there had been whispers of wrongdoing, now there were murmurs of misunderstanding. Details were blurred, softened, or quietly corrected. Language became vague. Instead of describing what had happened plainly, people spoke in abstractions: complicated situation, private matter, legal misunderstanding. Each phrase stripped the act of its brutality, recasting it as an unfortunate but manageable complication. This reframing did not happen in a single coordinated effort, but through many small decisions made by individuals acting in what they believed to be their own best interests. Business partners chose not to ask further questions. Social acquaintances avoided the topic entirely. Clergy emphasized forgiveness over truth. Each choice pushed the city further away from justice and closer to closure without resolution. There were consequences, but they were uneven and incomplete. Some relationships cooled. Invitations became less frequent in certain circles. A faint discomfort followed the merchant into rooms that had once welcomed him unconditionally, but these were social adjustments, not moral judgments. They signaled unease, not condemnation. He was not expelled from society, he was simply repositioned within it. For those who might have expected punishment, this outcome was deeply unsettling. The system had moved swiftly to protect itself, absorbing the shock without transforming. There was no sense that the rules had changed, only that an anomaly had been managed. The message was subtle but clear. The system remained intact, and it would not be questioned. The law, having already played its role, receded into the background. Its involvement had ended once procedures were followed. There was no mechanism to revisit the moral implications of what had occurred. Legal closure was mistaken for ethical closure. The absence of further action was interpreted as finality, even though nothing had truly been resolved. The wife's fate, meanwhile, existed largely outside public conversation. Her suffering did not fit neatly into the city's need for closure. Acknowledging it would have required confronting the full horror of the act, and that was precisely what Charleston wanted to avoid. Instead, her story was fragmented, spoken of only in whispers, if at all. She became an absence rather than a presence, defined more by what was not said than by what was known. This erasure was not accidental. It was necessary for the city's emotional survival. To fully acknowledge her experience would have shattered the illusion that Charleston was a place of order and refinement. It would have forced people to see themselves as complicit, not merely unfortunate witnesses. Erasure was easier than empathy. The merchant himself adapted quickly to this new equilibrium. He learned which spaces welcomed him and which did not. He adjusted his behavior, softened his presence, avoided unnecessary attention. Survival had always been his guiding principle, and it served him again here. He did not need redemption. He needed acceptance. And Charleston, despite its discomfort, was willing to provide just enough of it. What is striking is how quickly the city normalized this adjusted reality. Humans are remarkably adept at adapting to injustice when it is presented as unavoidable. The initial shock gave way to resignation. Conversations moved on. New concerns replaced old ones. The scandal became a reference point rather than an active wound. Remember when, instead of how could, this normalization had profound consequences. It taught the city that even the most extreme violations could be survived without fundamental change. It reinforced the idea that stability was resilient, capable of absorbing anything as long as appearances were maintained. This lesson did not go unnoticed by others with power. Boundaries shifted quietly, expanding the range of what seemed possible. For those on the margins of society, the outcome was a warning. It demonstrated that the system would not protect them if their suffering conflicted with the interests of the powerful. Justice, they learned, was conditional. It flowed upward, not downward. This understanding deepened existing inequalities, reinforcing fear and resignation. There were moments when the story threatened to resurface. A comment made too openly. A question asked by someone less invested in silence. Each time the city responded swiftly, though not overtly. The conversation would change. The speaker would be gently corrected or subtly isolated. The message was reinforced without being spoken. This matter was settled. Settled, however, did not mean resolved. Beneath the surface, tension lingered. Some carried guilt they could not fully articulate. Others carried anger they had nowhere to direct. But without collective acknowledgement, these emotions remained private, powerless. The city had denied itself the language needed to process what had happened. The absence of justice also meant the absence of learning. Systems evolve when they are challenged. Without challenge, they stagnate. Charleston's institutions emerged from this episode unchanged, convinced of their own adequacy. The possibility that they had failed profoundly was never seriously entertained. Failure would have required accountability, and accountability threatened stability. In the years that followed, the incident became increasingly abstract. Details were lost or deliberately obscured. Records went missing. Memories faded. What remained was a vague sense that something dark had occurred, without clarity or context. This ambiguity served the city well. Ambiguity does not demand action, certainty does. The merchant's life continued, altered but not destroyed. He navigated his reduced circle with the same calculation that had guided him before. The absence of severe consequence reinforced his belief that the system ultimately favored those who understood it. Whatever private reckoning he experienced, if any, was invisible to the world. Publicly, the chapter was closed. For the wife, closure was an illusion. Her story did not benefit from the city's need to move on. She was not granted the luxury of forgetting. Yet, without a public platform, her suffering existed only in fragments, preserved perhaps in memory, perhaps not at all. The system that had erased her agency now erased her narrative. This imbalance between whose stories endured and whose vanished reveals the true nature of Charleston's response. Justice was not merely absent, it was replaced by management. The goal was not to repair harm, but to minimize disruption. In this framework, human pain was secondary to social continuity. The city congratulated itself implicitly on having weathered the storm. Life went on, commerce thrived, social rituals resumed. Charleston's self-image remained largely intact. This survival was framed as strength, not avoidance. Few questioned whether what had been preserved was worth the cost. What makes this stage of the story particularly disturbing is how reasonable it all appeared to those involved. Each decision, taken alone, seemed pragmatic. Avoid scandal, protect livelihoods, maintain order. Together, these choices formed a pattern of profound injustice, but that pattern was never named as such. Without a name, it could not be confronted. The absence of justice also reshaped memory. Over time, the story became less about a specific act and more about a general unease. The sharper edges were worn away. What had once been unthinkable became simply unfortunate. This softening allowed the city to coexist with its past without truly acknowledging it. Charleston's response demonstrated a fundamental truth about power. It does not always need to punish to prevail. Sometimes it simply waits. Time, silence, and normalization do the work. Outrage fades, curiosity dulls. What remains is a quiet acceptance that things are as they are. This acceptance had consequences beyond the immediate moment. It reinforced a culture in which Liddy was mistaken for morality and silence for peace. It taught future generations that challenging authority was risky and often futile. The lesson was not taught explicitly, but it was absorbed nonetheless. The scandal did not end with justice denied. It ended with understanding denied. Without understanding, there could be no change. The city carried on, burdened by a history it refused to fully confront. The absence of visible consequence became a kind of permission, signaling that the system would protect itself even at the expense of humanity. In the end, what Charleston achieved was not resolution, but containment. The damage was limited, the narrative controlled, the disruption minimized. But containment is not healing, it is merely postponement. The unresolved truth remained, buried beneath layers of politeness and forgetfulness. This stage of the story forces an uncomfortable realization. Injustice does not always announce itself with violence or chaos. Sometimes it concludes quietly, with handshakes and reassurances, with a collective decision to move on. That quiet conclusion can be more devastating than open conflict, because it leaves the underlying conditions unchanged. The consequences without justice became part of Charleston's legacy, whether acknowledged or not. They shaped how power was understood, how silence was valued, how suffering was weighed against stability. The city survived the scandal, but survival came at a cost that was never fully measured, and perhaps that is the most haunting aspect of all. Not that justice failed, but that its absence was accepted as normal. The story did not end with punishment or redemption. It ended with adjustment, accommodation, and forgetting. Charleston did not collapse under the weight of what had happened. It absorbed it, carried on, and in doing so, ensured that the lesson learned was not how to prevent such acts, but how to live with them. That is not justice, it is endurance. And endurance, when divorced from accountability, can be one of the most powerful enablers of harm. The aftermath of the scandal stretched far beyond the immediate events, embedding itself into Charleston's social fabric in ways both subtle and profound. Time, which usually heals, instead acted as a layer of dust, covering over the raw edges of what had occurred, softening memory but never fully erasing it. The merchant remained in the city, his public persona largely intact, but the invisible lines of suspicion and quiet disapproval had begun to form around him. These lines were almost imperceptible, the gentle tightening of social space. Yet they carried a weight heavier than any public censure. Charleston had survived, but not unchanged. The city had adapted, just as its residents had adapted, and in that adaptation lay both preservation and a quiet, persistent shadow. For many, life returned to an uneasy normalcy. Commerce continued, social events resumed, and the rhythms of daily life masked the turbulent beneath. Yet beneath the surface, subtle shifts began to appear. Those who had known the truth, or at least fragments of it, carried private judgments that were rarely voiced but always felt. Glances lingered longer. Invitations were extended more cautiously, and conversations skirted sensitive areas. In this way, the scandal was never truly gone. It had merely transformed, becoming a quiet, persistent current influencing behavior, relationships, and trust. Over the years, Charleston developed a collective memory that was simultaneously selective and distorted. The story of the merchant and his wife became something like a legend, told in fragments that emphasized mystery over fact. Details were exaggerated or softened depending on who told them, but the underlying question, how could such an event occur within a society that prided itself on order and morality, remained. That question lingered, unspoken yet insistent, haunting the conversations of those who sensed its gravity, but lacked the courage or context to confront it directly. It became less about specific culpability and more about the fragility of social structures, the ease with which appearances could mask reality. The wife's presence in history was even more precarious. Though legally erased and socially marginalized, her story persisted in quieter, less official ways. Accounts of her disappearance or sudden absence circulated in hushed whispers, passed from one generation to the next, often without names, dates, or certainty. She became a symbol of what could be lost when the mechanisms of power, legality, and social expectation aligned against a single individual. Her absence was instructive. It was a reminder that visibility and voice were privileges, and that the systems that enforced them could just as easily deny them. The merchant, for his part, adapted seamlessly to this new reality. Experience had taught him the value of appearances, and he continued to cultivate the persona that had protected him thus far. Polished, composed, and socially engaged, he moved through Charleston society with minimal disruption. Yet even as he maintained control publicly, the undercurrent of unease followed him. People whispered, avoided, and speculated. Social capital, while largely intact, was subtly recalibrated. In a city built on networks of influence, this recalibration mattered. It was a quiet reminder that actions, no matter how shielded by law or reputation, leave traces that cannot be fully erased. Charleston itself continued to evolve, carrying forward lessons from the incident without naming them explicitly. The event became a silent teacher, demonstrating the power of bureaucratic procedure, social compliance, and the careful maintenance of appearances. People learned that legality could protect even morally reprehensible acts, and that silence and inaction could function as tacit consent. These lessons shaped behaviors, influencing how individuals wielded power and how society responded to transgressions. Authority was understood not just as formal law but as socially enforced expectation, and the consequences of challenging that authority were internalized quickly. The city's institutions emerged largely unscathed, but they too were subtly reshaped. Legal processes that had been exploited in this case were codified into precedents, reinforcing the boundaries between permissible and impermissible action. Social hierarchies remained intact, but their invisible contours were adjusted to reflect lessons learned from the incident. Individuals understood that transgressions committed under the guise of authority could be tolerated, provided they were executed with discretion. The mechanisms of enforcement, reward, and punishment became less about absolute morality and more about the maintenance of order and control. Generations that followed grew up in a society where the story was known only partially, filtered through layers of discretion, rumor, and selective memory. Its ambiguity allowed it to endure without demanding resolution. The lesson embedded within the narrative was clear: power carries protection, law can obscure morality, and silence can serve as both shield and weapon. Those born into this context internalized these truths, often unconsciously shaping their understanding of authority, justice, and societal expectation. For the merchant's family, the consequences were nuanced but persistent. Reputation, though largely maintained, carried a shadow. Social alliances shifted subtly over time. Descendants and close associates found themselves navigating inherited suspicions, hints of scandal, and the unspoken knowledge that public perception could diverge sharply from private reality. Legacy in Charleston was not merely about wealth or achievement. It was about managing perception, controlling narrative, and negotiating the unspoken social contracts that governed inclusion, influence, and honor. The events of 1839 became a benchmark, an invisible template for future caution and strategic conduct. The broader implications extended beyond Charleston's immediate social circles. Outsiders, historians, and later generations looking back found a landscape shaped by gaps in documentation, silences in public record, and the unreliability of narrative transmitted orally. The story of the merchant and his wife became emblematic of a society capable of sustaining itself on carefully constructed facades, where appearances could substitute for accountability and legal form could overshadow moral substance. Scholars and observers would later puzzle over these patterns, noting how social and legal structures interacted to protect privilege while marginalizing vulnerability. Yet even as time softened memory and distorted detail, the emotional weight persisted in subtle ways. For those who remembered or suspected the truth, there was a lingering sense of injustice, a quiet, unresolved tension. Charleston had survived the incident, but its social conscience had been compromised. Collective ethics were recalibrated, calibrated more toward self-preservation than toward universal principles of justice. People learned that compliance, avoidance, and discretion were often more socially rewarded than courage or confrontation. The silence surrounding the event also contributed to a culture of careful observation and indirect communication. Charleston residents learned to read subtleties, a pause in speech, a fleeting glance, an avoidance of certain topics. These micro-signals became a form of social literacy, allowing individuals to navigate complex moral and social landscapes without explicit confrontation. In this way, the event's legacy extended beyond legal precedent into the very language of daily interaction, shaping behavior, relationships, and the transmission of cultural norms. Over time, the Merchants' Act, once shocking, became embedded as a cautionary tale with multiple interpretations. Some framed it as an example of the dangers of unchecked power, others as a demonstration of the limits of legality and the fragility of social ethics. Its lessons were moral, social, and political, though often obscured by the passage of time. The story's endurance relied less on facts than on the questions it raised. How could such an act be carried out? How could it remain unpunished? How did society reconcile its ideals with its complicity? These questions persisted, prompting reflection even as specific details faded. Charleston's approach to the aftermath highlights a broader pattern in human societies, the tendency to prioritize continuity over justice, perception over truth, and stability over moral reckoning. The city's collective response exemplifies how institutions and communities can absorb trauma without fully addressing its causes, creating legacies that echo quietly across generations. The event became a touchstone for understanding the interplay between power, legality, and social responsibility. The story also underscores the importance of memory, documentation, and narrative control. What is remembered, how it is remembered, and what is left unspoken all shape the way societies understand themselves and their histories. In this case, the selective preservation of events, the suppression of certain voices, and the normalization of silence allowed a profound injustice to endure within a framework of apparent normalcy. Charleston did not forget entirely, but it reframed, obscured, and integrated the event into a broader tapestry of social practice. For the broader historical record, this has consequences. Researchers, writers, and future generations must grapple not only with documented facts, but with gaps, absences, and silences that distort understanding. The wife's story, largely erased from public memory, requires reconstruction from fragmentary evidence, careful reading of whispers, and a recognition of the systems that sought to render her invisible. In doing so, the incident becomes a lens for examining how power operates, how societies enforce complicity, and how memory itself is contested. The enduring legacy of the merchant's actions is not limited to individuals. It extends to the city itself, shaping cultural norms, social expectations, and the moral imagination of Charleston's residents. The boundaries of acceptable behavior, the limits of inquiry, and the interplay between legality and morality were all recalibrated by this incident. It became a model for understanding risk, authority, and the consequences of action versus inaction. Even as the scandal receded into history, its lessons persisted in the behaviors and assumptions of the community. Ultimately, the story concludes not with closure but with questions. The city moved on, but the human and ethical dimensions of the act remained unresolved. The merchant survived with his reputation intact. The wife was silenced, and society recalibrated around the tension between legality and morality. The tale's endurance lies in its capacity to provoke reflection, to illustrate the fragility of justice, and to expose the ways in which power, law, and social expectation can converge to protect privilege while erasing vulnerability. Charleston's forgotten scandal became both a historical fact and a moral question, one whose echoes continue to resonate long after the immediate actors have disappeared. The story reminds us that the legacies of injustice are rarely neat or confined. They ripple outward, shaping institutions, culture, and individual consciousness. History may record events, but it also preserves the silences, omissions, and accommodations that define their true impact. The city, the merchant, and the forgotten wife together form a narrative that is not easily reconciled, a testament to the enduring tension between human ambition, social order, and ethical responsibility. In this way, the scandal of 1839 does not merely belong to the past, it remains a living lesson, a warning of how societies negotiate power and morality, and how stories, once silenced, continue to demand attention even as they are obscured by time. Charleston survived, but at what cost? The question lingers, unanswered, a shadow over a city that learned to live with the consequences of its own complicity. The moral ambiguity, the quiet endurance, the persistence of unanswered questions, all these elements together create a legacy that challenges historians, citizens, and observers alike. They invite reflection not only on what happened, but on how societies choose to respond, what they value, and which voices are amplified versus erased. In every whispered retelling, in every fragment of memory preserved, there remains the possibility of reckoning, the potential to confront what was tolerated, and to understand the full human weight of what occurred. And so, the scandal persists, not as a single event frozen in time, but as an ongoing dialogue between history and memory, legal, and morality, silence and voice. Its story is incomplete, its lessons partially obscured, yet its resonance remains undeniable, a testament to the enduring complexity of human behavior, social structures, and the difficult, often uncomfortable truths that shape our understanding of justice, power, and consequence.